Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We are with our Brute Quintessence Labs, who is level 36. Need 600 and some odd thousand to get to level 37 in our next set of enhancement slots, and we are on a story arc for Anton Sampson. He says, according to those transfer orders you found, the Nemesis armies plan to assemble their prototype Nemesis battlesuit in a hidden lab. Go stop it, essentially. So go to Dark Astoria, and that is accessed by going to Ouroboros. So I think this is possibly the end of the story arc. If that is the case, then we'll do, I guess, one more mission here for whoever the next contact will be. But then I'm going to, as usual, stop recording until we have another story arc. Since I don't think there's really any need for you guys to see me going through random missions that don't mean anything story-wise. You will see plenty enough of this character's 30s by just watching the story arcs. So hopefully everybody's fine with that decision. At any rate, we need to defeat all the soldiers in the lab, and then if we have time, we'll do, depending on how long this mission is, we'll do a second mission. Maybe a third. Depends. All depends on how long the missions happen to be. So these are going to be +2 and +3 Nemesis. Generally not too much trouble. And we will be able to use Soul Drain a lot more now because we have a recharge enhancer on it. So this group, we want to start with the Lancer Surgeon. It looks like, because we don't want that guy healing the others. How come this guy isn't noticing me? I feel like the mobs have been very inobservant the last couple of missions that I've done. And that guy should definitely be aggroing to me. There will be lots of misses as we fight the +3s, because we do have like -15 or something to hit them. So as we go, I'd like to talk about a couple of things in role-playing games. As usual, this came up in the D&D Beyond forum, but this could be for any role-playing game. Both of these issues. So the first issue, both of these issues were brought up by one DM who said, "What do I do?" So problem number one is, this is not that this is really a problem, but issue number one is that these problems are occurring amongst a group of people who are all friends. Right, and so that means that it's really hard to be tough on someone if you're perhaps playing in a group and you're the 4-pay dungeon master. You can boot somebody out. You don't get their subscription fee anymore for you DMing, but what do you care? And you don't mind if they get mad. You never have to speak to them again. And if you're playing an adventurers club, same thing. But if you are playing with some real life friends, people you've known for years, people for whom you have a great deal of affection, and people perhaps who you're going to have to see possibly outside of the game quite often, family members, people like that, it can be very difficult when you have someone who's playing in a way that you're not happy with, because you can't necessarily lower the boom on somebody that you're really good friends with without jeopardizing the friendship. And one of the things to always keep in mind, I think it was Matt Colville who said this, is that there's no guarantee that just because you're friends with someone in real life, outside of gaming, that you're necessarily going to enjoy playing D&D with that person. You may have very similar tastes in, say, novels and movies, but very different tastes when it comes to role-playing games. whether it's Champions or even City of Heroes. In terms of, I mean, if you look at me, I was on a supergroup for years. I hardly ever adventured with them because they wanted to play the farming way, and I don't. Now, we were able to do roleplay events, regardless of that, and it didn't matter. But I think some of them, sometimes they did get frustrated by the fact that I almost never joined them in their like group missions because they were almost always doing some kind of farming or doing incarnate trials, and I wasn't really into either of those things. Now, that doesn't make you or them a bad person if you are not necessarily compatible roleplay wise. And these are people that I was friendly enough with that to this day, even though I quit the group, I don't know, 6 months ago, maybe more, and the group sort of ceased to officially exist 3 or 4 or 5 months ago. I mean, it's been a long while that it's just a group of people who used to play City of Heroes together and now kind of hang out. And there aren't that many of us left that actively talk in the chat channels and the Discord. Maybe a dozen or two dozen max. 2 dozen may sound like a lot, but at one point we had like 100 players, many of whom were active. I like them enough that I still hang out there and chat with them, and they still chat with me, and we tease each other, and we get along really well inside the Discord, chatting about things up to and including City of Heroes, but many of them just simply did not have a compatible playstyle with me. And so I think this may be what's going to be happening in the example I'm talking about. But unfortunately, it's very difficult, and it can be very painful when this happens, that you're not compatible with somebody that you're very good friends with otherwise in your role-playing game. The guy that I have often mentioned who did a lot of literal cheating and breaking of house rules and stuff like that, I was quite fond of him outside the game. We'd go to the movies together, we'd go over each other's houses and hang out, we'd ride bikes together, whatever. I had a ball with him. He was great. But get him behind the wheel of a role-playing game character, and he was a nightmare. And it was mostly because he played the game so differently from the way I did. He approached it so differently that our two approaches simply weren't compatible. And, sometimes you can work this sort of thing out, but a lot of times you can't. And it's often kind of better to just admit that and say, let's just stop playing Champions together, than it is to say, let's keep trying to play Champions together and jeopardize the friendship. So what are the two circumstances this one game master was talking about? Well, one is that he's playing his group through Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And it's a published module, and there's a lot of material about it online in addition to the actual module itself, including advice for DMs on how to play the various named NPCs, both in terms of their roleplay and in terms of how they should do things in battle. Now this guy, I think he's far enough we don't have to taunt him. I was thinking about whether he might buff the guys below him, but I don't think he will. Look at that. 3 misses in a row, and then forced it by Streak Breaker. So 4 misses in a row with a 75% chance. Nah, there's nothing wrong with the random number generator of this game. Unbelievable. It's literally like playing D&D against something with an armor class of 10 that you have +5 to hit and missing 4 times in a row. Yes, it's possible, but if that happened, most people would take a second look at the die they were rolling, because it's very unusual. Okay, so there's 2 sergeants there, which means one of them is going to buff the other unless I get them out of there. So let's try to move these guys up here. So here are the 2 circumstances. Circumstance 1, the DM said, is that he's using this Waterdeep, and again, it's a published module with known kind of descriptions online, wikis about how to run these NPCs, and I guess either he's not paying a lot of attention to those things, or he has made the conscious decision to run them in a different way from the way they're generally published to be run, or perhaps just doing his own interpretation of something that, sometimes you can make more than one interpretation of a sentence. He's interpreting it one way versus another way. One of the players has been reading up on Waterdeep. I don't think he's been reading the module, the adventure itself. I think he's been reading all the advice on the wikis, and he's saying you're not playing these guys the way it says to play them on the wikis. You're doing it wrong to the DM. And the DM's getting very frustrated. All the care I used, and I still managed to buff that lieutenant. Well, we'll take an inspiration. So the DM's getting frustrated because the DM gets to run the NPCs however the DM wants, no matter what the book says, and certainly no matter what the wiki says. And this is his interpretation of how this NPC acts, and the player doesn't get to challenge that. So he's very frustrated about that, and he said, what do I do about it? And it's very difficult. Several GMs have said, tell him to stop reading the wiki. One person even said that they would go so far as to say, if you keep reading it, I will stop GMing. Now, the thing is, that was a sniper, by the way, shooting at us. He won't chase us. They never do. So we're going to just see what's in this doorway, because this is going not to the elevator. So we'll take care of this first. It's defeat all. So GMs have varied between saying, look, I don't care what the wiki says. That's just a suggestion. I can... Oh, it's the same path. I can do this however I want. Some saying stop reading it. Others saying if you keep reading it, I'm not going to DM. Or if you're going to keep reading it, I'm kicking you out of the group. There's really no easy solution to this. If the player wants to read it, you can't actually stop them. Right? There's nothing you can do to stop them if they really want to read it. So, I mean, you could say, I'll stop GMing if you read it, but then my guess is it's not going to stop them from reading it. What it might do is stop them from complaining about it. Right? Because then they'd have to admit they read it if they complained. But otherwise, that's very difficult. It's really hard to stop somebody from reading the material. My best friend, as I've mentioned here, has gone through the entire Dungeon Master's Guide, reading up on all of the magic item properties and deciding which ones he wants for his character based on what he read in the DMG. And I told him, you shouldn't do that. That's spoilers. He wants to do it. He wants to optimize his character. I really don't know where this is coming from with this guy, because when we played Champions, he sure as heck was not a character optimizer. I guess he always wanted to be, and just wasn't that good at optimizing Champions characters. I don't know, but he's really, maybe because of MMOs, and because optimization of characters is a big thing in MMOs like City of Heroes, he's just gotten so used to it that he's trying to do it in D&D as well. But, when he makes up a D&D character, he levels it to, 15th level just to, see what the best options are to take, so that he can continue to optimize the character. Now, I'm going to let this sniper shoot at me, because if we go in there and fight him, then I'm going to be fighting everybody plus him at the same time, and he's got a long range, so he's not going to move, so we're just going to pull these guys back here. Oh, and I need to do super jump. I don't know, there's no really easy solution to this. I had to just put up with the fact that my friend read every magic item in the game and decide to make up my own magic items to offset this fact, which is kind of frustrating because I don't always have the time or desire. Oh, wow. Every one of these guys is a sniper. All right, well, we're going to have no choice but to take some hits then. Let's put on the defense, because every one of them can see me and they will not chase you. There's nothing you can do about it. So we're just going to take them one at a time and be pounded by the other guys. And I'm going to ignore the non-snipers because they're not as accurate. They don't do as much damage. Glad we have a self-heal. There's another sniper. So now I gotta aggro like the entire group, the entire room. But there's no choice. Let's get some extra accuracy to make sure we hit these guys, because they're all +3 as well. This is a heck of a room. Get some endurance. So that's one problem, is how do I deal with a player who is essentially cheating? Well, combination. It's not just cheating, right? He's reading up on stuff which he shouldn't do, and then he's criticizing me because I'm not doing what it says in the book, right? This would literally be like the player in my game complaining that I changed how the Ring of Spell Storing works, and it works a different way in my campaign because he wants it to work the way it says in the book. Like, no, I purposely changed it from the way it says it in the book because you keep spoilerizing things, right? So, so yeah, that's not an easy problem to solve. The second problem that the same player, and I'm not sure, he was very confusing with his pronouns, so I'm not sure which player is which, but it sounds like this player is playing a character who is eventually going to be multi-classed into a wizard, but isn't yet a multi-class into wizard, right? So he's, whatever he is now, a fighter with Eldritch Knight or something, and he's going to eventually take wizard. And they've come across some spell scrolls. And what this player wants to do, while they have the spell scroll in hand, is copy the spell scrolls over into his wizard book. And the GM is like, but you, copying spells into your wizard book is a characteristic, is an ability of the wizard class. You haven't taken that class yet. You're going to do that in a future level. So you can't, it's like saying I want to take the Cure Wounds spell, which is a cleric spell, before I get the cleric class. You can't do that. So he said, you know, like, he's an Eldritch Knight. Eldritch Knights get some spellcasting ability, but they do not get the ability to write in a spell book. Only wizards can do that. And so there's another sniper. So, you know, people who responded to this said, well, Eldritch Knights, I guess, can make spell scrolls, so you could allow them to make a spell scroll of the spell, like to copy one scroll onto another, but that sort of defeats the purpose, because when you copy a scroll, it erases it. So basically you're just spending time taking the spell from one sheet of paper and putting it on another, and then it automatically deletes it from the first one, so like you still only have one sheet of paper. So I'm not sure what the point is, but they were like, well, if he wants to do some copying, you know, you could allow him to do that. But if he's not a wizard, he's certainly not supposed to be writing stuff in a spellbook, because only wizards can do that. But this guy's been arguing, and I guess the DM said that, and the other DMs are saying, yes, we support you, we agree with you that this is a correct ruling. But I guess the player doesn't like it, and he's been arguing with this DM a lot. So he said, what do I do? Because he keeps arguing with me at the table about stuff like this. And it's frustrating. And again, there are no easy solutions to this, because if this is one of your best friends, it's really hard to tell your best friend, look, I don't like the way you're playing D&D. And if the guy doesn't want to stop, which it sounds like he probably doesn't, then you might have to kick him out of the group. That's really hard. You know, even my patented answer to something like this, which at this point would be, you know, even in my current D&D group, if you think you're a better DM than I am, you DM. Right? If you want to rule things, if you want to decide how rulings go, I am perfectly happy to step aside right now. I've been DMing for a year. I'm starting to get tired. I would like a break. If you're that convinced that you know how to play D&D better than I do, I'm perfectly willing to agree that that's true. I'll stipulate you DM. you start next week, right? Or you start after this adventure's over. And a couple of other people mentioned that too. And the one guy said, um, usually one of two things will happen. Almost always they back down because they don't actually want a DM. And if they don't back down, if they say okay, he said give it a couple, maybe 5 sessions, a couple months, and they'll be begging you to come back because most people really don't want to do it. And my experience was the one player who had been mildly critical, right? And I said, well, you want a GM for a while. He took over for the summer. I needed a break. I think A, he didn't love doing it, and B, the other players did not like it because he wasn't a very good GM. He was an okay GM, but I work really hard. I do a lot to make my game immersive for my players, and I put a lot of time into the adventure before they ever see a minute of it in person or on the virtual tabletop nowadays. And so I do a lot of that work, much of which is not evident to someone who hasn't GM'd before, and even much of which is not evident to people who have GM because they're not paying attention to what's going on behind the screens. Let me give you an example. A friend of mine introduced me to best GM I ever had. Introduced me to this, the idea of a pre-battle, like a testing a battle. Now he had his own way of doing it. I eventually came up with a technique. I don't do this in D&D, but in Champions, and I find it's too hard to do in D&D because there are too many variables to me. I think to some degree there are a lot of variables, and to some degree it's just that I am so intuitively. I find Champions so intuitive. It's just in my bones that I can do it more easily. Basically, I take the character sheets and I run a battle. I start the battle, and I try to play both sides as tactically competently as possible. I know how the players usually approach battles, and this is not the final mission. I know how the players usually approach battles, and so I try to do what they usually do in combat, or what I think they'll do. I then try to have the villains be as smart as possible, or as smart as is indicated by their intelligence score on their character sheet and the background I've written for them. And I would assume all 2 hit rolls were 11s. Right? At first, I would actually roll it out, and then I realized a couple times like I got really lucky or really unlucky, and that the test battle had hinged on the fact that I was super lucky, and I can't count on that. So just every 3d6 roll is an 11. So if you have an 11 or less to hit, you hit. If you have less than like a 10 or less to hit, you miss. And so I just would, and all the damage rolls were 10d6s automatically does 35 stun and 10 body, and I figured out sort of just a ballpark approximate how much endurance each character uses each phase, and I just took that amount off rather than sort of tracking all the endurance just to make it quicker. But when I did this, that enabled me to really get a good idea of just how likely it was that the characters would be able to win or lose the battle. And nobody saw me do that, right? I just automatically did it. But because I was doing that and spending hours doing that for each scenario, testing every single battle, all of the battles went the way I expected, right? Like the players never lost when I expected them to win, or won when I expected them to lose. They almost always won because I usually planned for them to win. And when I wanted a battle to be hard, it was hard. And when I wanted it to be a walkover, it was a walkover. And so I almost never was surprised by how hard a battle was. And they never saw the tests. I don't think they knew I was doing it. But they saw the results of those tests because the battles were great. And every single battle was fun. And every single battle had interesting, cool stuff in the terrain to use. And I had predicted what they were going to do accurately enough that doing all this prep took me time, but then the actual battle went super smoothly. And I now knew what every villain was going to do. I didn't have to look stuff up on their character sheet because I'd already practiced it. I expected what the players were going to do, and so when they told me what they were doing, I didn't have to ask them, "What does this thing do on your character sheet?" I knew it already because I had already rehearsed, right? So it's like rehearsing a play. I had rehearsed, and the other GMs didn't do that. So it was, battles that were supposed to be easy would just be really hard, or battles that were supposed to be hard would be a walkover, and it would throw the GM, and the GM often didn't even know what their own villains were capable of doing in a battle. They would be surprised themselves by something they wrote in their character sheet the other day. And so that lack of prep came through in just how the game played, even though no one knew I was doing it. And so this is true for a lot of players. They don't see the behind the scenes of what the GM is doing. Even if you're using a module like Waterdeep, you're doing a lot of prep. Maybe more prep than if you homebrew, because you got to read what somebody else wrote and get their headspace into your headspace to figure out how to run this module. And a lot of players just think, oh, you just opened the book and started to run it. That's not how it works. And anybody who tried to do that would have an utter disaster on their hands. And I think sometimes, especially for players who's never done it, it's a good idea to say, well, why don't you DM for a while and get to see what it's like. Now, I will say, don't do it back to them, right? If they're being a jerk, don't be a jerk back to them. Try to be as good a player as you can, as cooperative a player as you can, but let them see what it's like to sit in the GM chair for a while. It can be an eye-opening experience. So, Anton says, it looks like they've already assembled a battle suit, and they're getting ready to test it. If you can make those tests fail, Quintessence lasts, maybe they'll scrap the whole thing. Yes, we're going to do that. Go take on a legendary false nemesis in Skyway City. And how are we doing on time? All right, this is a long episode, but I think we're going to go ahead and do this. We've got all our inspirations. Orange is just about as good as purple for us because it stacks. We have, instead of having super high defense and super high resistance, we have moderately high defense and moderately high resistance, so we can stack either one of them. So I'm perfectly happy with a big orange versus a big purple. We're going to go to Skyway City and defeat the prototype and its handlers. So yeah, and this is I have to say, by far, it's not even a little bit close. It is by far the most difficult thing in role-playing games is when you and your friends are not compatible in the way you approach the game. It's just bad. It's very frustrating. It's very painful because you love this person, you want to game with them. Might be a family member. I'm dying to teach my nephews D&D, but I'm also a little worried about it because I'm afraid that, I might hate the way they play D&D. And then it's going to cause friction, and we're going to have to stop. Now, I could just say, guys, I don't have time to DM for you or whatever, and that'll probably be all right. We're fighting Ricky now? What the heck? Everybody's after the suit, I guess? It's very difficult, and there really are no easy, good answers to this problem of not being compatible with the other person, right? If the person is constantly arguing rulings with you, that's very tough. If the person is cheating and reading stuff about the bad guys before your mission starts, that's tough. When we were I'll never forget this, when we were playing Champions, it was an infamous battle called the 12 on 12. We had 12 villains. For the Great Supervillain Contest, we had 2 superhero groups, Gamma Force and the Crusaders, and then there was like a guest star, because the Gamma Force was 6, Crusaders were 5, and then one of our friends who wasn't on either team kind of came in as a solo hero, and so it was a bunch of players. I want to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 players, and me as a GM. They were playing 12 heroes. One of the heroes, I guess, was my NPC. My character is an NPC. And then I had 12 villains. And I had pulled out a bunch of villains from the book Enemies, which is which is basically just like a monster manual for champions. It had 30 or 40 superheroes um, that were pre-designed by the designers of champions. And so, because I needed more villains for that fight, I pulled out some pretty famous or infamous villains from the enemies books, including Ankylosaur, and there's our false nemesis. Ankylosaur and Wyvern, and I can't remember who else. Firewing might have been in there, and I remember I was talking to one of my friends, and I think it might have been my best friend, but I can't remember who. The battle was so long and so involved that it took us 2 days. We started on a Saturday, we got partway through it, and then we were going to finish up the next day on Sunday. And this can't be it. Maybe it is. I don't know. So I was talking to one of my friends, and I feel like it was my best friend. I'm not really sure. In the middle, so they're halfway through this battle, and he makes a comment to me. Somebody made the comment to me about, oh yeah, Firewing is vulnerable to blah blah. I can't remember what Firewing was vulnerable to. He takes 2 times stun or whatever. He's vulnerable to, everybody had the enemies book, right? And we had all seen the Firewing character, but you don't memorize it, right? So he said, oh yeah, Firewing is vulnerable to whatever. I can't remember what he's vulnerable to, ice or something. And I said to him, how do you know that? Like, are you looking in enemies? You're not supposed to do that. I mean, it's one thing, yes, you own it, and you may have read it before, but once you know you're fighting the villain right now in your game, you don't go look it up. He was like, oh, no, I just remember that. I remember seeing it. Yeah, sure. He looked it up. He was sitting there looking at the stats of the villains. I immediately went to my enemies book, opened it up, and changed. That was really easy. I opened it up and changed all the vulnerabilities of every villain in my book. I just took a pencil and drew a line through it and changed them. This guy's vulnerable to psionics, draw a line through it. Now he's vulnerable to lasers. This guy's vulnerable to ice, draw a line through it. Now he's vulnerable to lightning. And I didn't think about whether it makes sense for the character, right? Because the one thing that makes sense for the character is what they wrote in the book. But I'm like, if the players are going to be looking up the vulnerabilities of the villains when they have no reason to know this, then I've got to change this, or they're going to just walk all over the villains, right? It's just not going to be... I mean, everybody was having fun. It was a really tight battle. It was a tough battle. A couple people had gone unconscious, but since everybody was playing multiple characters, it didn't matter that much. Some of the villains had gone unconscious, and I think there were still about 7 of each left, one of whom was Firewing, who was a very powerful villain. And now they're going to start looking up the vulnerabilities of the villains. That's going to ruin the fight, right? That's going to make it too easy. So it can be very tough, because I was mad at the guy who said this, right? And I could have started a fight right there. Instead, I just changed their vulnerabilities. And that I shouldn't have done, really, because those characters were all part of a shared world that we all GM'd. So it wasn't like, well, my Firewing is this way. No, our Firewing is the one in enemies. Everybody used it, right? Or could use it. And so it's very tough, because you can end up getting into fights with people. So the thing to remember is, just because you're friends with somebody doesn't necessarily mean you're compatible with them in D&D, and you need to realize that you may have to say, look, for the good of our friendship, we need to stop playing D&D or Champions or whatever together, because we're clearly not compatible with this, and we're going to end up ruining the friendship if we're constantly arguing over the role-playing game. I don't know how else to do it other than to say, you DM, and then just don't do it back to the guy, right? I didn't look up stuff like that when the other GM was running somebody like Firewing, even though he'd done it to me, because that only would have made it worse, right? That would have just made the problem bigger. And so you just have to try to make sure you value that friendship higher than you value the game. All right, let's call our contact. That's the end of the story arc. And he says the destruction of the prototype should set Nemesis research back. Well, not really, because we know that there are like a bunch of these that we're going to fight in the 40s. So the presence of a new robot based on Nemesis technology strongly indicates that the real and true Nemesis is at the head of these new armies. A lot of people had hoped it was just a copycat organization, but it looks like it's real. Yes, it is. All right, folks. That's the end of this episode and the end of my recording for a little while as I work on getting into another contact. I'm not sure who we're going to do next. Maybe Gordon Stacy. Haven't done any Brickstown people. Yep. Oh, Steve Sheridan. Yeah, we'll probably do him next. So we'll start with him, and we'll go from there. But until he gives me a story arc, I'm going to just stop recording. And that's good because I've been recording more than once a day, and I'm getting way behind. This is Season 4, and I'm still posting Season 2. So I'm like at the end of Season 2. So I'm like a whole season behind. So we got to try to catch up. Next time you see me, I will probably have completed our enhancement set here. I just checked again today, and I still have 4 days haven't elapsed. So I think that'll be tomorrow. I can't remember when I last purchased them. So we should have another set, which will be the final ATO set. And then the other sets will be cheaper, just reward merits and influence, but a smaller number of reward merits, if I remember right. And we'll start working on some other sets. I'm not sure which ones we want yet, because I've been focused on the ATOs. So until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been City of Heroes on the Rebirth server.